Miles, welcome back into the back room.
Andy, great to be here.
2025. Quite a year.
Yeah, the best of all the years. Uh, Honestly, there's never been a better year. It's really, everybody knows it.
And how are you doing in this fantastic
Uh,
year?
yeah, I've had better ones.
Yeah.
It's been a roller coaster ride, and I
Hmm.
don't want to lead off by saying I told you so, but well, yeah, no,
Oh, you
I
told
will.
us so.
Yeah, I told you so. Never
Definitely
mind.
told us so.
I'll lead off with that.
Twice, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, twice maybe. I mean, joking aside. This year has really, I think, defied expectations, even my own, of how crazy it would get politically
Mm.
here in the United States, and that continues. I mean, day to day, hour to hour, we are seeing everything from the extraordinary and unpredictable to the very predictable and very alarming happening here in our country.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, and let's start off with the elephant in the room, which is the executive order
Yeah.
pertaining to you. How did you learn of that? And were you surprised when it happened, or did you expect something like this was coming?
So it was April 9th of this year, and I was actually on the way back from taking our little 10-pound mini Aussie Doodle to the dog groomer. And I will not forget that day for a lot of reasons, but one of them was just one of the most beautiful days of the year so far. I mean, perfect blue sky, spring day, remarkable. And I get home with the little, now very fluffy, clean dog, and my wife was pulling in the driveway at the same time with our infant daughter. And we both got out of the car and we thought, gosh, this is just a remarkable day. And as we're sort of commenting on that, I get a message on my phone from someone who said, hey, you need to turn on the news. The president's in the Oval Office right now talking about you. And, my heart sank because this was something, Andy, in part I was expecting. I mean, I'd spent several years predicting that if this guy came back into office, he would engage in an unprecedented campaign of revenge using all elements of national power. And then he sort of sold that message for me because after years of saying that, Trump came out, as everyone remembers, during the campaign and said, I am your retribution, and made very clear his plan was to exact revenge. So, we suspected if he won again, he would try to find a way to come after not just me, but anyone else who had served in the Republican Party and criticized him and cost him the election in 2020. What we didn't expect is that it would look the way that it did on April 9th. So I did open up my phone after I got that message, went on to Twitter, I think it was, and saw live as the president was finishing up his remarks. And it was evident to me that it wasn't like the other executive orders that had come in the months leading up to that, where, people's security clearances were revoked or he said mean things. He used this order to accuse me of having committed treason, which is a crime punishable by death in the United States, and to launch a federal investigation into me for my criticisms of the president. And, removing myself from this as much as I can, this was unprecedented, as I later found out, the first time in American history that a U.S. president had ordered an investigation into one of his critics by executive order for protected speech. And so it started to dawn on us, me and my wife, in the minutes and the hours after that, that this was going to be a much bigger undertaking to fend off.
Hmm. And you established endpresidentialrevenge.org. Tell us about this initiative and overall how you're fighting back against Trump's targeting of you.
Yeah, I mean, look, the honest answer it's is a really tough decision to make to fight back against something like this. I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer, right? The president of the United States accuses you of the highest crime in the United States. Of course, you didn't commit treason. You go fight back. But look at what has happened under this administration. They've gone after the law firms and the educational institutions and, businesses and countries that don't do what the president wants. And they ruin those targets if they want to. They are able to wield all elements of national power to really punish their enemies. And so, yeah, we had already been hit by this executive order. But then for several weeks, my wife and I talked about, do we really want to be out there publicly fighting back against this? Won't that invite more attacks, more stalkers, more crazy people, more persecution from the administration? And we came to the conclusion that yes, while it probably would make things more difficult for us, we couldn't look our daughter in the eye years from now and say, yeah, the president of the United States called your dad a traitor to the world and had our family investigated, but we didn't do anything about it. And by the way, by standing in the shadows, we made it a lot easier for him to go after our friends and their friends and more people in this country. And so we decided to start fighting back. And to your question, that was a very intimidating thing because we don't have the resources ourselves to fight back against something like this. When the president comes after you, part of the punishment is the process. They know that you
Mhm.
have to lawyer up. They know that those lawyers are insanely expensive and they can bankrupt you before ever bringing a fabricated charge against you. And that was clear to us in the days after this order dropped that this could get really expensive really, really fast. And my wife looked at me and said, are we going to have to sell the house? And I said, I don't know, because that might be the only way that we can protect ourselves. Fortunately, a really great organization came forward called Whistleblower Aid. These are the folks that represented the intelligence community whistleblower during the Ukraine impeachment in Trump's first term, and a lot of other whistleblowers throughout the years. And they said, look, we will launch a legal defense fund, a nonprofit, to help you and other whistleblowers who are being targeted by the White House defend themselves. And so they helped us launch, endpresidentialrevenge.org. It's endpresidentialrevenge.org, which has been a game changer for us because I'll be blunt, our legal defense has been crowdsourced by people across the country who I've never met. And we've been
Mm.
able to, because of that, do things that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. Namely, we had our legal team go file a formal complaint with the inspectors general of the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security to ask them to effectively investigate the investigators. In other words, my lawyers tell me the president's executive orders targeting me for revenge is patently unconstitutional. It is so obviously nakedly unconstitutional on its face that anyone engaged in carrying out that order is likely engaged in illegal activity and unconstitutional
Mm.
activity. So as a first step, we've asked those inspector generals to go assess whether that's the case, to assess whether people are breaking the law in furtherance of this order. Now, that's a first step. I mean, there's a number of other legal steps that we're exploring, but without belaboring it, Andy, I mean, there's all of these other things that happen after something like this. It cost me my business, and I had to have lawyers fight to protect the business that I had built. We've had stalkers come after us, make vile threats against my daughter and my wife and our family members. You got to go fight them in court. I mean, there's just this rapid proliferation of things that happen in your life. And all the president's done so far is put his signature on this very, very mean executive order, right? They haven't announced charges against me. They haven't raided the house, things that we expect to happen. But just that signature has had really catastrophic effects for us.
Mhm.
But we're immensely grateful for all the public support we've had from folks throughout this.
Yeah, well, you're speaking to the financial. I'm sure there's also the mental anguish and the concerns to personal safety. And, maybe, that's the end goal is, like you said before, the process. It's just what can we do to make Miles not happy for a while and cost him on several levels.
Well, and they know, and the president certainly knows that regardless of what his lieutenants do in these departments and carrying out investigations like this, his supporters will prosecute those targets no matter what. And when he says, someone's guilty of treason, even if Donald Trump himself doesn't take those allegations seriously, those followers do. And that's part of what we've grappled with some of these folks who've threatened our family is they will say very explicitly, you are a traitor. We want to put you in front of a firing squad. That's a really scary message when it arrives on your wife's phone. And you don't know if that person's down the street getting ready to show up or they're, across the country in Oregon. But you have to take it seriously and you have to report that to federal authorities. And then, you start peeling back the onion and you find that potentially, yeah, there are scary people out there thinking scary things about you and your family. And, we know where the source of that is. I mean, Trump fans those flames. He blows that dog whistle, if you will, to get followers out there to do that. But there is another component, Andy, that has surprised me in all of this. And I didn't think there was too much that could surprise me about Trump's return to power. But part of it is the level of social fear this time is a lot different than it was last time. I was able to speak out against Trump in his first term, leave his administration, and go out there publicly and really still maintain my core support network and social circle. People who were cheering us on. Uh, the level of fear is exponentially higher this time. People are very worried about being the next target, the next law firm, the next university, the next person targeted by this administration, that it's really changed behavior. And let me be more specific about it. Some of the closest people to us, very close friends, and some family have backed away amidst this. And not because they're necessarily MAGA aligned folks, but because they're very afraid of also getting pulled into the mix. That has surprised me to see really close friends say, hey, we need to keep our distance from you and Hannah until this is all over. Well, why? Well, it's just, I don't want them to come after my business, and folks that you would have thought, think of your best friend, Andy, someone who said to you, I'm ride or die, dude. Whatever happens to you and the pod and life, and, if there were divorces and deaths and just the things that happen in life, I'm with you, man. And then to have someone like that sit down with you and say, I can't really be with you for this. We've had to
And
have.
how does that impact the relationship? Like, are you in a place where you're able to go, I don't like it, but I understand it and I'll accept it? Or is that a game changer for you?
It's hard. It depends on the person. But some of those people that you expect, it's especially the folks who you've been with them through some of the hardest things they've been through, or you've stood up for them publicly or that sort of thing. Then when you're going through this and they say, yeah, I gotta step away. That irrevocably destroys the friendship or the relationship. Is really hard to bounce back from. Now, at the same time, I mean, I understand the fear. I mean, I understand that
Mm-hmm.
any, rational person might want to run in the face of this. Um, but, there's folks in your life who you think when they say, I'm ride or die, I'm in the trenches, it's like, okay, yeah, no matter what, they'll fight this righteous fight with me. So it's hard to lose those people. But the social fear has gone a lot further than I thought. And the administration has made sure of it. I mean, after the president signed the order, they started firing people from the executive branch that they found were connected to me on social media platforms or were friends. They fired a guy from DHS who was at my wedding, and the White House placed the story in the Washington Post because they found a picture of him on Facebook at my wedding. And so they made very clear that's why he was fired, to send a signal to people. You better back away from this guy. They deliberately want to get rid of that support network. And we've seen that cascade out. As I've done events around the country, not just for our legal defense, but to protect other whistleblowers, we've had venues canceling on us. We've had caterers canceling on us because they've said, look, we support what you're doing, but, we don't want to have our employees deported. Like, think about that
Mhm.
for a second. That,
Sure.
in blue cities across the country, there are businesses saying, yeah, we can't help host an event for someone who's criticizing the president because, he's doing mass deportations and that could really affect our people. That's a level of social fear that didn't exist
Sure.
in the first Trump administration.
And in terms of just overall intimidation, like what do you think the executive order can and will have on other former officials or just anyone, I guess, who may want to speak out? I mean, isn't that the point of it all?
Well, here's the remarkable thing about it, Andy, is you and I could have this conversation and say that even though that's an informed assessment, that it might be a speculative one, right? We don't really know what the president's real motivation is, except in this case we do, because in the immediate wake of the investigative orders against myself and Chris Krebs. They sent out senior White House officials to go talk to a couple of publications about why they did it. And they said it was to, quote, send a message that the president needed to show he was going to get scalps from his enemies, and that they needed to send that signal early. I mean, there's a Rolling Stone article where these guys are quoted as basically admitting, yeah, we're coming after these folks to scare other people, which is craven and awful in its own right. But then there's the reality that to a certain extent, it has worked. And I spend a lot of time talking to ex-Trump officials, former senior leaders in the Republican Party, people who've come and spoken out in the past few years about this wayward president. And a number of them, as you've probably noted and others have noted, have gone kind of quiet at the start of the second Trump administration. And that's for a reason, because they've seen these revenge orders and those folks are worried. I mean, they're worried that they're the next one on the list. A lot of them have lawyers on retainer in preparation. And, they've continued to target people to make sure that folks stay silent. And we just saw that with, former President Barack Obama was just accused by Donald Trump of committing treason. And now they're launching what they call a DOJ strike force to look into senior Obama officials alleging that their engagement in the 2016 election and Russian interference was tantamount to treason. And so now you've got a whole bunch of those folks like me and like our family who are having to lawyer up and preparing for, possible investigation by the Justice Department. And so that I hate to say it, but the intimidation works. It keeps people quiet. And I just had a conversation about this yesterday with Andy McCabe, great guy. Andy. He had been acting director of the FBI during the first Trump administration, lifelong public servant, fantastic guy, not a partisan guy at all. And Andy and I talked about how in the first administration, he was targeted by Trump. He was targeted by Trump because as the head of the FBI, he had to oversee, the Russia investigation. And I think Andy handled that about as well as anyone could. But by virtue of being in that position, Trump went after him and said, I'm going to take your pension and we're going to fire you. And, they did all these retributive things. And I asked Andy, I said, talk to me about your decision to fight back publicly, because at the time you didn't let him level those accusations and then just sit on your hands and follow the advice of the lawyers and stay quiet until you could face him off in court. You went out there and you defended your name. And Andy said, when you're in a position like that, one of the last means of defense you have is your voice, because they start to strip everything from you, like we just talked about, your social support network, your financial security, your physical safety. They strip all these things away. And one of the last things you have is just your voice. And it was so resonant to me because we're going through it now. And I just said, Andy, I'm grateful, because even now we still have friends and family that will say, oh man, you don't want to poke the bear anymore, right? I mean, like you probably should just lay low until this blows over. And my message to them is, it's not blowing over. It doesn't blow over. This guy doesn't forget. And, I spent the past 2 years quietly building a business, had moved on from, talking about Donald Trump, and it still didn't matter, because he still came back in and said, I'm going to get you. And it's the mistake we always make with Donald Trump. He's just joking, or he doesn't mean it. No, he means it. And if you don't speak out, if you don't defend yourself, if you don't defend this country, if you don't defend first principles, you will lose them. You will lose all of those things. And, it's the conclusion Andy came to. It's the conclusion we had to come to amidst this, is we're just not going to shut up, because if we shut up, then it works.
And from a timeline perspective, are there hearings coming up? Like, where do you see it going?
Yeah.
Ultimately, what's the status of your case right now?
Yeah, the honest answer is we don't know, because there's so much less transparency and oversight in this administration. We've not heard back from the inspectors general. And I don't want to reach any conclusions yet, but I will just say after this week, I'm worried about whether those watchdogs are able to perform their duties inside the government. An example this week would be this past week, Emile Beauvais, Trump's most controversial judicial nominee, got confirmed to the federal bench. and probably shouldn't have been because there were pretty damning whistleblower complaints against him, including one that the Department of Justice claims they lost, even though they had it for 3 months. In the hours before the vote, the inspector general at DOJ said, "Oh, we found it." Well, that was too late for any senators to review it and change their vote. Um, that's pretty scary if the internal watchdogs are asleep at the wheel so much that on these really crucial votes that affect our justice system, they're not, fulfilling their duties. And so that was worrying to me to see. So, we're going to give it a little bit more time here to assess whether the IGs are able to do their work. But absent that, there are other affirmative legal steps that we're planning to take. But more bluntly, Andy, let me just say this. We don't know if on any given day, Kash Patel's guys from the FBI will roll up to our house and raid the house and have things go forward. I mean, this is a constant and real fear. We have a very elaborate security system here on our property, and every morning at like 4 or 5 a.m., I wake up every morning since then thinking, okay, is today the day I'm going to hear that loud ding and there's going to be, 5 black SUVs flying down the driveway. And, then I got to go wake the baby up and my wife and say, it's happening.
Mm.
That's really scary when you know you've not done anything wrong. I mean, it's scary in general, but when you know you're innocent, you have not committed treason, you haven't shared state secrets with the enemy, and yet your government still may come after you. And I was warned, 5 or 6 years ago when I came forward against Trump, hey, be careful out there. There's a friend who was a Secret Service agent. He said, be careful out there because, we're in a wild moment. And you go do this and talk about this guy, one day guys with guns might show up at your door. When he said that, though, I never imagined that those guys with guns might be my own government, right? The
Yeah.
worry was always a lunatic out there. And now the worry is, law enforcement has been co opted by the president for personal revenge.
Yeah. Well, I want to shift in a minute to the more macro subject of whistleblowing, but with regard to the EO, I'm sure there was a lot of folks in the MAGA verse who were thrilled to see Trump sign that thing. But if you could send one message to the people out there who are underestimating the significance of this executive order, what would that be?
Uh, the only thing stopping you from being the target of it is just whether the president decides that he has time to sign his signature. I mean, that's what's so remarkable is the president is now personally directing investigations into people. We have never seen this in modern history in the United States. In fact, the justice system is built the way that it is, with separation between the White House and the Justice Department and the line prosecutors and the agents for a reason, because you don't want an American president deciding first that someone is guilty of something and then second ordering his team to go find the evidence, right? That's the inverse of the justice process. And that's exactly what happened on April 9th. The president sat at a desk. He said, effectively, Miles Taylor is guilty of treason. And now, team, please go find evidence that Miles Taylor is guilty of treason. It's not how the justice system works. So
Mm.
sets a bad precedent, one, for everyone. It undermines the system of justice. But two, it means any business, any person who crosses Trump is only a signature away from being targeted. And to the folks on the MAGA side, Andy, I would say this to them. You're only one administration away from this potentially happening to you if we let this precedent stand. We don't want any American chief executive, Democrat or Republican of any party, to have the ability to unilaterally open investigations into their enemies. And if they keep doing that, I shudder to think what happens if a far left president comes in and says, you know what, now I'm going to investigate every conservative university, every conservative business leader. I'm going to go after all the individual commentators on One American News Network. That too would be wrong. But I think it'll be very hard to hold back the tide if we go into another administration that isn't Trump and folks want to unwind his behavior. There will be a great temptation for people to use the same tactics he used. And that's why we've got to nip it in the bud while he's president. Get the courts to do their job. Show that these things are illegal, because otherwise this spreads. And, free speech in this country becomes an absolute relic.
Mhm. Help us also understand, help the folks out there understand why whistleblowing is such a critical safeguard in a functioning democracy, particularly within the national security and intelligence communities.
Yeah. Well, especially in the national security community. Look, I mean, when you come into an agency like the FBI or the CIA or the Department of Homeland Security, you have an obligation to protect state secrets. And it's a obligation that I've, assiduously upheld, and most people do when they go into that community. But if in the course of your job you witnessed wrongdoing, there have to be lawful ways to go expose that wrongdoing. Now, none of the misconduct that I exposed about Donald Trump had to do per se with classified decisions and classified national security information. But there are a lot of things that can happen in that world that, even if they're bad and they happen, you can't go out and talk about them publicly because they could put Americans in danger. And so you want to create the avenues for people to go sound the alarm. And an example of that, of course, would be what I alluded to earlier was during the Ukraine impeachment. You had an anonymous whistleblower from the intelligence community who said, look, I witnessed a phone call with the president. And that phone call was, a reportedly, classified conversation. And I think he engaged in a very clear act of corruption. And that whistleblower went through a chain of flagging it for the intelligence community inspector general and reporting it to the congressional committees to make sure that the right people found out about it, to be able to hold the president accountable and to shine a light without putting Americans in danger or sources and methods of intelligence collection in danger. That's really, really important. And we would not have known about Trump doing that if it hadn't been for that whistleblower. So here's the worry. Trump is very, very aware that there are these avenues for lawful disclosure of misconduct. And he has, and his team has systematically tried to shut down those avenues or to make it more dangerous for whistleblowers to come forward. How have they done that? They've placed political loyalists in some of those key positions that are supposed to be nonpartisan positions, where people oversee whistleblower complaints. So from the get-go, if you are a federal employee and you say, yeah, I've witnessed presidential misconduct, well, you now know that if I go file that complaint, it's going to the desk of a guy who's maybe a 24-year-old Trump campaign operative whose first phone call is not going to be to the lawyers. It's going to be to Stephen Miller at the White House to say, well, you wouldn't believe what I just got. And then the retaliation isn't just possible. It's probably guaranteed that that person's going to be fired and gotten rid of before that complaint sees the light of day. And so there's a self-censoring happening right now in the federal government of employees who are witnessing all sorts of wrongdoing, whether it's by DOJ or the president's appointees, but they're scared to come forward because they know that those avenues of blowing the whistle are no longer safe. And that's bad for all of us because as Americans, as taxpayers, I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you want to know what your government's doing with your money. You have a right to know what your government's doing with your money. And we are all less likely to know what's actually going on in these agencies because there's a deliberate campaign of intimidation. And this continues every single day. And in fact, a lot of these stories don't reach the headlines, but every day there are civil servants being fired punitively or preemptively to send a message. And offices Trump doesn't like. I mean, just since the start of the administration, 200 of the most qualified prosecutors and experts in the Justice Department have been given the boot and kicked out. I mean, tens of thousands of government employees in other agencies. But, at the Justice Department, these have been very surgical in places where you've got lawyers who would normally, protect inherent government functions or be able to bring cases if there was wrongdoing witnessed, and they've been tossed out the door because the president doesn't want internal watchdogs. The president doesn't want people with a conscience calling out his team. So that's pretty scary to see. And the net effect of all of that is we, the American people, are more in the dark, and it enables Trump and his team to carry out activities that would otherwise be deemed immoral, unethical, or potentially unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible for Americans under those circumstances to truly feel secure about not just how government is spending our money, but how they're operating overall behind the scenes when whistleblowers face these increasing risks professionally, personally, legally, when they come forward. Like it's really creating a landscape that is not conducive to the American people being able to hold its elected officials accountable.
Well, and let me give you an example, like a real concrete example, Andy, of something that I would have never thought was plausible, that now is plausible because of the clampdown on truth telling inside the federal government. In the first administration, my former boss, John Kelly, who went to become White House chief of staff, called one day and was talking about a crazy thing that the president had asked for. And Donald Trump was really frustrated at the leaks coming out of his White House. People saying bad things about him, people talking about how undisciplined he was, people telling the truth about what it was like to work around Donald Trump and see him make decisions. And he says to John Kelly something to the effect of, I want to wiretap the White House staff. I want to know who's talking to the press. And of course, this is absurd because the White House staff, even though they work for the president, are still private American citizens who have a Fourth Amendment right to not have their private phone calls tapped. Even if they're calling reporters, even if they're shit talking the president, they have a right to be able to go engage in First Amendment protected speech. And so Kelly obviously knew this. And, I said, well, Chief, what'd you do? He said, of course. I said, no, that's, we're not going to do something like that. We're not going to go wiretap the White House staff. And even if John Kelly hadn't been there, at the time, I later told people, look, this isn't something that Trump would be able to do, right? If he wanted to go wiretap all the White House staff, okay, then he's got to go to John Kelly, who then has to go to the FBI director, who then has to tap several agents, who then have to open lawfully predicated investigations into the White House staff. And then they got to go get approval, to go up on their devices. And there's a whole bunch of people in that chain that would need to be touched who all will ask the question, wait, am I being asked to break the law? Who might go, consult with lawyers. And then the thing falls apart, right? And that's why a lot of conspiracies in government don't end up really happening because they're too hard to carry out. Too many people are in the mix. Okay, so that was deemed implausible by me to happen. I want to go back to this conversation I just said I had with Andy McCabe, who had been FBI director. I posed this to Andy the other day, and his comment was something to the effect of, yeah, doing something like that, going and spying on Americans and conducting investigations into them is a lot easier now than it was before because the president has made sure the people in that chain of command are loyalists, that there is a tighter chain of command, that it's easier for him to go directly to that line agent who might conduct that investigation, and that there is clear intimidation for anyone in that chain who might say, I think this is wrong. I should go talk to the lawyers. Clarity to them what will happen if they do that. They will be called out, they will lose their jobs, and they'll potentially face a revenge prosecution from the president. And so you've got these GS-14s, that's the government pay scale, sort of like an upper, middle manager, these GS-14s in these agencies who might normally be on the receiving end of an unlawful request and say, I can't do this, I got to go to the lawyers, who are now completely terrified that their lives and their livelihood will be destroyed if they don't follow these orders because they see what's happening to their peers. They see what's happening on TV to a Miles Taylor, and they're going to find a way to try to bubble wrap it in legalese so it's not their problem and make it go away. And I don't mean to demean public servants. These are great public servants who are being put in horrible, horrible circumstances, but it's now much more possible for the president to engage in that sort of extraordinary misconduct, spying on the opposition without the American people being alerted to it.
Do you believe the current legal protections for whistleblowers in the United States are still strong enough despite these threats?
I don't. I don't think there are sufficient protections. And there had been an effort a bipartisan effort after Trump's first term. At least there were some Republicans on the legislation to fortify the inspectors general across departments and agencies, to strengthen whistleblower protections, to make it easier for people to come forward, make their disclosures, and also receive comprehensive protection from retaliation. And that legislation didn't pass. And I think that we're going to look back, and historians will look back after this administration and say, we made a grievous mistake. We left these people vulnerable. And as a result, we left ourselves in the dark. And fortunately, there are civil society groups, who've stood up to sort of fill that gap. I mentioned Whistleblower Aid, that's helping our family. Groups like that are out there to provide not just the legal support, but services to provide digital protection so people aren't hacking your devices and trying to get into your bank accounts and ruin your life in other ways, and a whole range of other services. That's really good that there's organizations like that out there, but they're having trouble meeting the moment because we are witnessing misconduct at a scale and scope we have never seen before inside the federal government. And, if we don't really step it up, we're going to miss some of these things that are happening that put all of our constitutional rights at risk. So it's a very alarming environment. But at the end of the day, honestly, besides whistleblower protection laws, besides the civil society groups out there protecting people, our single best defense against a wayward chief executive, a president who wants to engage in revenge against half the population who didn't vote for him, is not laws, it's not money, it's just courage. And
Mm.
courage is contagious. And if people see other people cowering, that is contagious too. And they will cower because they will say, well, if that person's too scared to stand up, I'm not going to be the first one to stand up. And the only way to counter that is for folks to show that the water's warm, that you can go out there, you can be brave, and it makes it easier for the next person to do exactly that. That's our best defense against someone who wants to silence dissent and attack free speech, is to show that we won't put up with it. And that's not just at the national level. I mean, we all feel it every single day in our own communities. You say the wrong thing, you're worried about getting canceled. Well, no, be that person then that takes the lead and says, no, I'm not going to be worried about it, because you'll be surprised to find how many people were holding their tongues who now feel freed not to.
Yeah, well, like you said, we still have our voices and we still have our votes. And, there's an important election coming up in 16 months, and I hope people are focusing on that. Miles, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your story and talking about these difficult subjects. And come back again and keep us updated.
Andy, great to be with you, and thank you for everything you do.
Likewise.